Today is Thursday, July 30th, 2015, and we are here today to interview Sister Margaret Farley. Our first question is, we would like to know about your journey of faith. What led you to the religious life?
Well, I didn't even consider religious life until I was a senior in college. Actually, it happened to be at then University of Detroit. And I took a course in ethics. And the course had nothing to do with vocation or anything like that. But I suddenly said, what am I doing with my life? And I had made plans, which didn't fit with that question. And so it took me 2 years to figure out whether I wanted to enter a religious community. And in those days, most of the women who entered a religious community came right out of high school, whereas I was 24 when I entered the community. And I entered it because I wanted to pick up my life and put it down in affirmation of God and serve the people of God.
Why did you choose the Sisters of Mercy versus another religious order?
Well, I knew them, for one thing. I had not gone to school to them or anything. My family had moved to Detroit just after I finished high school, and I did my grade school, high school education with the Benedictine sisters in Minnesota. So I really didn't know many orders in this area. So I did due diligence. I looked them all up, and I traveled around the country and visited them. And some of them were not interested in me because they seemed to think that I thought a vocation could come from studying philosophy. And so I shook the dust off my feet from those. But the Sisters of Mercy knew me because while I was a student at the University of Detroit, I practiced teaching at at OLM. And then after I graduated and had the quandary for 2 years deciding what I was going to do, I taught for 1 year as a regular faculty member at OLM. And they were very welcoming, and I already had a very profound focus in terms of mercy, the mercy of God, the mercy we all need, the mercy we need to share with one another. I think that was the motif that was at the heart of my selection of and they were willing to take me too.
So what was the focus of your education as a student?
My major was in English literature. I did minors in philosophy and in theater.
Theater?
Yes.
At the University of Detroit?
Yes. We had a great players group in those days. I don't know what it's like now, but...
Was David Riegel the head at that time?
No, it was... I knew I was going to forget names because, this was 50 years ago.
That's okay.
Professor Bergwin was the director of the theater at that time, and the theater was located in the top floor of the library.
The library.
Yes.
I've
it was
heard
a very intimate theater.
Yeah, we've heard that.
Yeah, but we had a wonderful time, and I had to work my way through school to some extent. My father was on the faculty, so we got a bit of a break in tuition, but so I worked part-time in the theater, not just participating as a student, but in the business office, in making costumes and all of that sort of thing, as well as acting and directing and so on.
Sounds like fun.
Yeah.
So tell us now about your time at Mercy College of Detroit.
I was a member of the philosophy department, and several things I remember quite vividly. When I just made my temporary vows, and so this was in 1962 when I joined the faculty. I had been teaching some courses to other novices and postulants and so on, but I was temporarily professed and then placed on the regular faculty. And I could have taught in the theology department or philosophy, but I already had a master's in philosophy, so that was the logical department for me. And at that time, Mercy College of Detroit was under some censorship by the American Association of University Professors.
The AAUP.
Yes, because someone, I don't remember the details, but there was someone in the English department who had published a book that didn't seem suitable. Now, I don't remember if the fact that they wouldn't let him teach that book or whether he was dismissed. I don't remember that. That happened before I got there, but that was the situation. And that went on for several years. And so I actually became a member of the faculty senate. It probably has a different name today, but, well, in the merger, probably does anyway. And I was quite active trying to get the college to get rid of that censorship. Now, I don't remember any details about what we had to do and so on, but I remember that vividly as part of my being there, or the situation at the college. I became great friends with many of the faculty, especially in the art department and others in the philosophy department. And just in general, it was a wonderful place to teach. There was camaraderie and trust among faculty, although, well, I remember one time that one of the faculty members said, we need to learn more about mercy. We're teaching in Mercy College. So then I wrote a paper and we gathered together. I remember talking about that at some time. But of course, I've been teaching for a long time. I had, this was my first formal higher education teaching, but now I've taught almost 40 years at Yale University and so on. And the most important thing for me in teaching in higher education is the students. I really, really respected and loved my students, and that's why I loved teaching.
Do you have a favorite story or a fond memory you want to tell us about your time there at Mercy College?
Well, I've been telling you a couple of them.
Yeah.
They're not exactly fond memories, some of them, but no, I'm not good at anecdotes, I think.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Well, you mentioned that you had a master's.
Yes.
Where did you get that?
I got that at the University of Detroit.
And your bachelor's there also?
Yes.
Okay.
And my master's, you had asked me what I studied at. And so I said English literature, but my master's was in philosophy.
Philosophy.
Yeah. I liked literature, but that was the time in the history of literature that everything was critical theory. And so I started out trying to do a master's in English literature, but what we were doing, I kept saying to myself, I'll never get to read any literature ever again. So I moved to the philosophy department.
How did you see your work impact the students at Mercy College? Or did you see an impact?
think so. I think my students, in addition to teaching, I think I was the faculty liaison, or whatever the term was, for the sodality at the time. And so I got to know some students, not just in the classroom, but very personally and so on.
Can you explain what the sodality is?
The sodality, it's so long ago that I get it mixed up with the sodality at what was then University of Detroit, but it was an organization within the school for students who wanted to have more depth in their spiritual life. And so I led retreats,
Your spiritual advisor?
Yes, I mean I wasn't named their spiritual advisor, but I was to help them grow in their spiritual life, their religious life. Yes.
Okay. So how have your roles changed over time? Sounds like you didn't stay in the city or the state of Michigan, in the city of Detroit or the state of Michigan. But how did your roles change with the Sisters of Mercy over time?
Well, I'm not sure they really changed, but I taught for 5 years at Mercy College of Detroit, and then that was the beginning of the time that if you wanted to teach in higher education, you had to get a PhD. So the then dean of the faculty, Sister Jean Malloy, I think was her name, came to me and said, we want to send you off for a doctorate. And so at the end of 5 years, in 1967, fall of 67, I was applying for admission, and I had to, this is kind of an anecdote, I had to decide whether I would try to do a doctorate in theology or in philosophy, because I was teaching both in a way. And I finally decided that I could do some of what I wanted to do in a philosophy department, but a religious studies department might allow me to do everything I wanted to do. And I was a little bit naive about this sort of thing at that time, but I only applied to 2 universities, and fortunately I got into both of them. So one was Fordham and the other was Yale University, and it was perfect for me because the department was religious studies, so I specialized in ethics, and I could do work both in philosophy and in theological ethics and social ethics. Okay, so that gets me, so then I moved to New Haven, Connecticut. I did my doctoral work there, and when I was just finishing my dissertation, I was invited to join the faculty at Yale Divinity School. Now, my relation to the Sisters of Mercy, that was a time that there were not very many nuns who left their own venues where they would get their degrees. And it was also a time that there were very few places that women could be admitted into theology or religious studies. Certainly in Catholic universities it was very difficult. So going to Yale was a perfect fit for me. And so when I went there, though, here's a little anecdote. Just before the spring before I was to go to Yale, I visited New Haven and tried to find a place to live and that sort of thing. And I went to what was then sort of the Newman Center at Yale and talked to the chaplain. The first thing he said to me was, well, he sat back and he said, well, nuns who come to Yale, they usually leave their orders. And I put that in my mind. I didn't respond to him. It probably was true. And he and I became great friends later on. I still tease him about that. But anyway, it was unusual for a nun to be off by herself at a university.
Away from your community?
Yes. However, our community is all across the country. We weren't juridically one community as Sisters of Mercy then, but there was a Connecticut Sisters of Mercy, as well as the Sisters of Mercy of the Union, of which Detroit was a province. So I lived as a student with some Sisters of Mercy from Connecticut. They were wonderful to live with, and I actually lived with them 17 years. I wasn't a student that long, but I stayed there when I joined the faculty too. And I've been very active in our community here. I mean, I consider Detroit Mercies as my home base, even though I've lived 50 years away from here. But I've been very active. I mean, I've come back for community meetings. I've been appointed to do things on committees for our community. I was designated as a sister from our province to go to an international meeting in Ireland. And so I feel, I always think there are several meanings to community. And through the last few years of changes, nuns everywhere discuss what community means and what should it be. And I've always said there are different levels. There's local level, in a local house together. There's province, or what we call today community, capital C, level, like West Midwest is now. And there's the national level, which has always been for me, because I entered a part of the Mercies that were members of the Union, Sisters of Mercy of the Union, so the national level. And I've been very active at all of those levels, and not in Detroit at the local level, but in Connecticut. I had a local community for a long time. And the sisters from here would come and visit me. I mean, the East Coast is a nice place to visit and so on. So I never have really felt that I'm away from the Detroit Mercies. At the same time, because of my work at other levels, I've gotten to know lots of Sisters of Mercy around the country and beyond. And even now part of what I do, I mean, I'm retired, so to speak, but it's a fiction. I work still all the time. And one of my projects is I co-direct a project in sub-Saharan Africa, working with sisters who are addressing the HIV and AIDS pandemic. So I've gotten to know sisters all over the world. So, I go back to the thing that chaplain said to me, nuns come here, they leave their orders. Well, I am so embedded in many worlds, and the central one is the Sisters of Mercy.
Can you talk a little bit more about your involvement with the HIV and
yes,
that
it's a little bit, well, you can edit it because I'll try to make it short. In the year 2000, Bill Clinton was president, and every year on World AIDS Day, he had a summit at the White House celebrating, or working summit, basically. And that particular year, people were finally waking up to the fact that religion has a religious institutions and so on. They're either part of the problem or part of the solution in regard to HIV and AIDS around the world. And so they invited leaders of world religions to the summit that year. Now, I'm not a leader of world religion, but I got a phone call, and I'm not sure where they got my name and so on, but I got a call from the group that was putting together the summit that year and asked if I would come as a theologian and just observe, and then at the end if I would give reflection, comment. So that got me into the world of AIDS. And I did that, and I'm not sure how the leaders of world religions appreciated what I had to say, because of course they were all men. There were a few women co-workers and so on at the summit too, but they were all men, and by and large old men. And nonetheless, the summit was so much better than I expected. It was really quite good. But as I was observing and listening, I said, well, they really are beginning to talk, not judgmentally about people who have AIDS, but to talk about compassion. And in regard to that, they talked about some of the factors involved, such as poverty. And I should say the majority of those who were at the summit were from Africa, and of course, especially the Sub-Sahara. And but nobody talked about sexuality. Nobody talked about the status of women in these areas and so on. So when I gave my reflection at the end, I talked how great it was that compassion was at the heart of this, and poverty was taken into account, but that here were the things I didn't hear. So I'm not sure what they thought of it, but anyway, I went back to Yale, and 2 months later approximately, I got a call from those who were putting together that summit, and they said they actually were part of a particular segment of what is still USAID, the development arm for the government, and they wanted to start a new program focused on women in faith-based communities in sub-Saharan Africa. But they said that they couldn't do it alone. They needed to work with someone like me, and someone with an institution like Yale Divinity School. So I immediately said, well, let me talk to some of my women colleagues and women students from Africa, and we were pretty clear that we shouldn't just decide to help out in Africa, but we already had connections with women theologians in Africa. They had a growing organization that they called the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians, and we were in touch with some of those. So we got in touch with them and said, what do you think of this? And because we never saw and don't yet still see ourselves as missionaries from the West going to help, so the next step was with the money from USAID, we were able to invite 25 women theologians to Yale Divinity School for a whole week, and we had 25 Western theologians, a couple one from Mexico, one from Canada, the rest were U.S., but a mixture of races and so on. So there were 50 of us all together, and we spent a week. And that's when I learned that the African women had never really spoken, even our students, had never really spoken together about their experience. And this was, it was ravaging their villages, their countries, and the weeping and gnashing, the awakening. I remember one of my students saying, when we first started to talk to our students about it, we had a few students from Africa at that time, And she looked at us and she said, yes, we know something about AIDS. She said, we don't call it that, though. We call it the thin disease, which was true across Africa at the time. And she said, we do see these graves being dug all along our streets, in front of our huts and so on. And all of them had parents or siblings or children even who had died of AIDS. So that's how I got involved. Now, when I retired, there was no one really ready to take that over. But I, all along, both at the summit meeting and also in our work with the African sisters, it was very hard to find Roman Catholic women with some training in theology that we could even, there weren't any at the summit. And we tried very hard in organizing our consultation at Yale Divinity School. And finally, out of the 50, we found 5 from Africa. But I talked with them there and said, we need to do something for the Catholic women. The others were primarily Protestant. We had a couple Hindus and one Muslim, I think. But where are the Catholics? And so I told you this is getting probably too long, but you could edit it or eliminate it. I was doing some theology update with some leadership teams in the Mercies at the time, and I kept talking about this, and so on. And my idea was that wouldn't this be a great idea for someone to take a hold of it and work with the Catholic women in Africa? I already had 3 full-time jobs. I was teaching full-time. I was working with this project, and I was for 8 years the co-director of Yale's interdisciplinary bioethics center. So I had no idea I could take on another. But anyway, to make a long story a little bit shorter, I knew a sister and people were referring me to her who might be interested, and she came and talked to me about it and finally decided she would like to do something like this, but she wouldn't do it if I wouldn't do it with her. So I became co-director of the All Africa Conference Sister to Sister, which I'm still co-director of. We've been doing this for 13 years. But we are now at a point, both of us, the co-directors, are looking seriously at succession planning.
So over these past, so it's been 13 years, have you seen
changes?
Has there been changes? We don't hear about it so much anymore, and I'm not sure if that's because it's getting better or because we've moved on to something else.
Yeah, complacency.
Yes.
Well, there certainly are improvements. First of all, the silence about it all has been broken. It took several years for that to happen because at the heart of it was stigmatization. No matter how people got HIV, they were immediately thought to be, they got it in a bad way. And but that's been broken. Education is out there now, even on billboards and so on. And but there were no antiretroviral drugs early on, so a lot of it was, now that it was out in the open at least, then what they desperately needed was orphanages, for example. Whole generations of adults were wiped out in those years. Parents, doctors, nurses, teachers. So there was a beginning growth in that regard. And then gradually, when the antiretrovirals became accessible in this country and other countries, and finally accessible partially in sub-Saharan Africa, that helped. But it's still the case. I don't think there's any country in Sub-Sahara that you could not say that they get antiretrovirals, but only enough for maybe 50% of those who need them. And then the really poor countries for maybe 10%. So it's still a huge problem. And our work, we've done a lot of conferences, and we don't do it. One of our principles is we put the agency in the hands of those who are most affected. And so we help them, we raise the funds for them. We've done regional conferences, working with the sisters working with us, of like 100 sisters at each one. And then out of those, some of them say we want a conference in our own country, so we've helped to facilitate that. And but now they're asking for even other levels of education, because when you're working in a plague, so to speak, and these are sisters, So the question, where is God in all of this, has come up again and again and again. And so we have done a 3-year pilot program, 5 months out of each year, sort of the equivalent of intensity of a summer school, where they study biblical studies, theology, critical thinking, etc. And now they want to go to another level to help found a school, primarily for sisters to begin with, and women, co-workers. And you have to raise a lot of money to start a school. But we're in the midst of it, and we've been very fortunate that we've been supported in most of what we've been able to facilitate by Sisters of Mercy, actually, and some other congregations, although our primary funding over the years, I'd have to say, is Catholic foundations. And but you can't go to the same wells too many times. So, but we've been I don't believe we've ever been turned down for a grant that we have applied for, which is, and part of our ability to get that support is there are lots of people and lots of foundations who want to help out in Africa in every particular way, but they've been burned many times because it's very hard to get the monies you raise directly to the people who need it, whereas our track record is perfect. We have a way of, because we're working with congregations of women religious, we have a way to make it work, and that makes a difference to foundations. So
make a big difference.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Okay, you've explained what you've done since you retired, but what was your research at Yale? Did you have a...
Ethics was my specialization. My dissertation was on an ethics of commitment. And I've said all along, I'm most interested in what ethicists would call meta-ethics. I'm most interested in questions of what it means to be a person, of what love is, of what justice is, and so on. But I've had less time to work on all those because ethicists don't always get to choose their own agenda. At least I felt that way, because we don't have answers we just give to people. We try to provide tools and to help people think through things. And so for myself, it was very important that my teaching responded to what the students needed, and what society needs, and what the church needs. So I taught just a sample of the courses I taught. I taught a large lecture course called The History of Christian Theological Ethics. It was not a survey course. It was studying the ethics of Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, John Calvin, and Martin Luther. Now, that fit what the students needed to learn in a divinity school, but I at least could do my themes in each one of these. But I also taught medical ethics. It needed to be taught, and I got into medical ethics because we have a lot of hospitals in some of our regions anyway. So I taught medical ethics at least every other year for many years. I taught sexual ethics because this was the early 70s, and the students needed to have a safe place to learn and to talk together and so on. I taught a course called The Relationship Between Christian Ethics, or the relationships between morality and Christian spirituality. I forgot the exact time, but the relationship between morality and spirituality. I loved all the courses I taught. The good thing at Yale is you get to teach what you want, So now, my research and writing is not necessarily in all of these things. I didn't do much in writing in medical ethics because I thought everybody else is doing. I've written a lot of articles, but no book or anything on that. I published a book, co-authored it with Father James McGlynn, who used to be at the University of Detroit, on metaphysics. We wrote a book together on the metaphysics of being and God. So I had one publication before I even went to do my doctorate. And I loved that kind of thing too, but you don't teach metaphysics at Yale, so, and metaphysics has probably gone out a lot, even in the Catholic universities, but it's a wonderful field. But my next book was following on. It was a complete revision, but it was also on commitment, and the title was Personal Commitments, Beginning, Keeping, Changing. And then I wrote a book, well, this one has some medical, entitled Compassionate Respect. And part of it is on medical ethics, but it goes beyond that. And has chapters, it's just a small book, but it has chapters on the meaning of compassion and respect and so on. And then, of course, I wrote the book that made me notorious, which is the book on just love, a framework for Christian sexual ethics. And I'm just finished publishing a collection of my essays called Changing the Questions.
Is that published yet?
It is published.
Oh, it is
yes,
published.
It's been out for several months. And I'm trying to work on a book that I originally worked on. Well, I didn't work on yes, I did. We got to a point where we were working on a book. I was a student of Father Jules Toner, who was also on the faculty at the University of Detroit when I was a student. And it's a book on free choice. So he's long dead, and I owe it to him to get this book done. But
I thought you were retired.
I said it was a fiction.
Yeah, you're right.
But what would I do? I don't sit and Sisters of Mine, I don't have any money to travel, and so I travel a lot, but it's only where somebody pays my way. I sing for my supper when I go. Yeah.
This wasn't initially part of our interview, but given the recent passing of Sister Kenise, we're wondering if you have a favorite story or a fond memory of her you'd like to share with us?
I'm not good at anecdotes. She was a wonderful human being. I mean, if you just look at the ministries that she began and got going, Cristo Rey and work at the inner city education program. She was a gentle person, but she would get things moving, you know. And I just have to say, I wasn't like best friends with her, and she was ahead of me in our growing up in the community. So I didn't know her as well as some other people might, but she was just a beacon of wisdom and concern and practical sense.
Okay. Now, do you have a favorite story or fond memory, Sister Agnes Mary Mansour?
Well, Agnes Mary and I were very good friends, she also was ahead of me in religion. I think she even was chronologically older than I. So we taught together at the Mercy College of Detroit. We're in the same convent there and so on. So, but this was also a time when changes were being made in religious communities, and we were asked to update and all that sort of thing. And she and I and a couple others sort of worked together on those kinds of issues, the deep issues of spirituality and the meaning of mercy and so on. Now, of course, I left Mercy College of Detroit. She stayed. She was president, and then, I remember her personality as well. I mean, she was just a wonderful person as well. But what she went through when, of course, she took the position in the state precisely to work with the poor, primarily. And then we had the unfortunate activities of the Vatican, who misinterpreted all of that, or who raised up some issues in a way that took away from other issues. So that when she was, well, in effect, forced out of the community didn't want her to leave, but they were sort of forced to go along with it. And I remember, I think I was in a shoe store on a street in the center of New Haven when it came over the news on a radio that was in that store about her dismissal. And I just, I went home, packed my bag, got on a plane, and came to see her. And I stayed with her overnight in Lansing. She was there. And, you know, she was all right. The community was devastated, of course. But she survived. And I gave the funeral, not the eulogy, I gave the homily at her funeral, which was a wonderful privilege to me. And in that, which I, of course, can't remember them much now, but I had anecdotes. The fact, probably other people know these too, she was always known after this happened to her, and of course she became an associate of the community, And we were still with her. And her saying was, "I shall always be a sister of mercy in my heart." And she was. So maybe that's enough.
Okay, thank you.
So her dismissal made national news.
Pardon me?
Her dismissal made national news then.
Yes, it did.
Sure.
Across the country. Yep,
Wow.
yep.
It was big news in
But it was.
Michigan.
Well, I'm sure.
It was big news.
But it made
here.
it across the country too. Yeah.
Last question.
Yes.
Is there anything we haven't discussed with you that you would like to tell us or expand upon?
Well, you've got me talking an awful lot, so
For a person that didn't have anecdotes, you'd have a lot of them. They're great.
I don't think so. I think that being on the faculty at the University of at the Mercy College of Detroit, and always being, I have threads through my life that can include the original UDM, Mercy College, and then the merger. I served for 3 terms, I think, on the Board of Trustees at UDM. So they're all part of my life, although I also have I have many worlds, I suppose, that come together in this life. So thank you for taking the
Thank
time
you.
to
Oh.
talk to the sisters.
Thank you for
We're getting so much out of it. I
That's
don't know
great.
if you are, but we are.
Yeah, great.